All right, so let's start talking about some of these specific objects, some of the ones that you're going to be using most often. Now, I'm here in Visual Studio within the project, and Object Browser is open. So I can look at this, I can see names, I can explore the different things that are available here, the different members of the different classes, any interfaces that are implemented, and so forth. But I don't have any documentation that really tells me what these are or how to use them. So let me go over here to Internet Explorer. And I did exactly what I just mentioned. I searched for Report Service 2010 namespace. I got a list of results in Bing or Google or whoever. And this is the main one that I want to use. So as you can see, it documents all of the classes and has links into more information about each of them. And so you can explore the methods. Now, this isn't real great at the resolution that I have, but nice thing about how Microsoft implemented this is that they have this little button and also double-headed arrow there, so I can get that out of the way. All right, so this is better. I still can't see the full width, but at least it's better for exploring the different things. So I just want to point out a few interesting things. So one thing that you'll probably work with a lot is catalog item. So this is any item within the report server database. And this also applies to SharePoint libraries as well. Nice thing here, of course, is that I can click on it and I can get some additional detail about it. Now, some of these entries are terse at best, is how I would describe it. So represents an item. Okay, that's interesting, but not terribly useful. But you can see the constructors, you can see all of the different properties, see what the different properties do and so forth, what the methods do. There's some remarks. Some are more complete than others. Some are fairly terse, like this one is. But it has a nice tip about retrieving user-defined properties and so forth and all. But some of the objects here do have some pretty detailed level of information. So anyway, that's catalog item. When you're just working with different items, particularly if you're performing management duties, creating items, moving them around, exposing them, looking at properties, and so forth. Another interesting one that you're likely to use is data source. So this represents a data source. So here you can work with a specific report object. So if we go into the detail here, you can see that has properties for item and name, but it also has information in order to get the type and get hash code for it and so forth. And so you can actually use this through the constructor in order to create a new data source. And that's probably the most important part of what's going on there. Okay, not today. Thank you, Microsoft. All right, a few other things. Data source credentials represent credentials so that you can manage what users have access to different objects on the report server. Field here represents a field in a data set of a report, so you can access it and work with that metadata. So you can actually look down inside the contents of objects as well. One really important one here is parameter value. So, as it says, represents data that's used in parameterized reports or in delivery extension settings. This is the object that you would use if you're going to execute a report using the execution web service. This is the object that you populate the value of a specific parameter. And then you have an array of these parameter value objects. Set that to, actually you call a method in order to set the parameter values on the web service in order to execute the report. And then when the report executes, it has those parameter values set. So it's really pretty slick. And then there's a related one here, parameter value or field reference. And this represents a user-supplied value or a field name that represents the value of a parameter. So if you have another field in a data set, that is the parameter value. You can use that as well. Okay, then reporting service 2010. This is the one object to rule them all. This contains the methods and properties that you use directly in order to access this web service. So this is a top-level object. You'll use other classes in order to support calling methods, but this is the main object that you use in order to implement things for this web service. So it's a very important object. And then you have a role. It represents a role for use in security. So you can define roles, move them around, assign different permissions and so forth. A schedule is how you can define a schedule for report subscriptions. And you can also define subscriptions within your application. So you could create a custom application that lets users define their own subscriptions without using Report Manager. Okay, so that's just a few of or just pointed out a few of the classes that are available. But most of these classes have a number of related classes that you can use to access just about every nook and cranny of reporting services. So if you explore these classes in the object browser, you can get a pretty good feel for the kind of information and operations that each classes gives you access to. And if you need more information, albeit not a huge amount more, you can come to the documentation here and explore them. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit more about that key class, Reporting Service 2010. That's this one right down here. If I go down far enough, down to the R's. So again, that's that top level object that you'll be using directly within your application. And then you also use these other classes to support these operations. So as you can see, this class has dozens of methods. And I want to talk about just a few of the more useful ones. But first, it's important to understand that many of the methods have both synchronous and asynchronous options. So you can see right here that I have cancel async and cancel job. I have cancel job async. So actually that's a standalone method, but I have a synchronous and an asynchronous form of the method. And as you scroll around in this, you'll find that that's the case for most of the methods, at least one version of each. So the nice thing about this is that it lets you build scalable and responsive applications that access that report server. And then if you explore these, you can see the different parameters that each requires. And so if you go back and forth, you can see that the only difference between these two is that the async version requires this user state. So that provides a way for getting a response in your application and responding to the response. Okay, so just looking at a few of these. One of them is that you can create a data source. So I'll move off there. And so this takes a number of parameters. So a string, that's the data source itself, the parent, whether or not you want to overwrite an existing definition with the same name. So that's just true, false, Boolean. And then the definition itself, which needs to be in a specific format, the XML, in order to provide that definition, which you can create within your application. And so by calling this method, you can actually create a data source and have it available on the report server. Probably a little bit more mundane is that you can create a folder as well. This can be a folder at the root level in the home folder that you can see in Report Manager, or a subfolder of another folder. And so if you want, this is the name of the folder, and then you can specify a parent or a null in order to make that a root folder. So you have complete control using this web service over the structure of the organization of your reports and other files on the report server. You can also create a linked report, a linked item, but more specifically, a linked item right there, that lets you create a linked report. So this is a way to centralize the repository of reports, but then have another easier navigation structure for a user to navigate in order to get to the reports that they're interested in using. All right, so there are a number of other create methods that you can use to create various objects. And of course, there's corresponding delete methods. So if you have an object on the server, you can delete it using these various methods. All right, you can do things like disable a data source and enable a data source. So not something you're likely to use often, but if maybe you're doing some maintenance, you can have a management application that disables a data source so users don't run any reports that are based on those data sources. There's various find methods, so you can find different objects. You can fire off events, you can flush the cache. You can generate a model. That isn't really useful anymore with more current versions of reporting services. You have some information about getting access to the cache. So there's a lot of get methods that let you get various objects and definitions on the report server. Something that will be helpful in a lot of applications will be the list methods. So there's where you can do things like list children is probably the most common one that you'll use. So this gives a list of all of the child items within a particular location on the report server. And most commonly, you'll use this in order to list all of the reports that are contained within a specific folder on the server. So very useful for that. All right, scrolling down more, a lot more list items here. List various things. You can log off the session. And there's also logging on a user, so you can log on as a specific user, different way of providing credentials for the reporting services session. You can move items. There's a couple move objects there. You can pause a schedule if you want to pause a schedule for whatever reason, for scheduled reports that are delivered to users in their inbox or various other ways. You can prepare queries. You can set cache options, a whole bunch of set options for essentially configuring various properties and state on the report server. There's some test ones. You can update items. And then there's various events and so forth that you can use in order to get notifications of different things that occur on the report server. Okay, so you start to get the sense that this is a pretty comprehensive web service. And again, this is just the management web service. You can explore the execution web service in the same way, going to the documentation and exploring it. But I'm going to leave it at this point, other than to add just one additional note. When you start working with report service code in a .NET application, IntelliSense is your friend. But you'll see some additional methods, things like abort and get web request, that are not listed here within this object. Now the reason for that is that those are inherited from some of the client protocols that the web service uses, as well as a few other objects. So you'll see them in IntelliSense. You won't see them here in Object Browser, but you will see them if you come back over here to the documentation and look at, come down here to the reporting service, that top level object, and scroll down here to look at the methods. You'll see abort. Again, this is not implemented as this reporting service 2010 object. Instead, this one is in particular inherited from the web client protocol. So the object implements or inherits from that particular object, and so gets those additional methods. And of course, it gets things like .object, which is implemented by system.object, because all objects in the .NET framework are derived from system.object. Okay? So just be aware that you'll see a few methods that aren't implemented by this class directly, so aren't in Object Browser, but are actually methods of the object because they inherited from some other class.